Well arrived degenerates, we are getting our reset day in EU as well, and what we're getting on this reset is our weekly update to Mythic Plus, which we checked over a week ago. So it's time to go over the changes to Mythic Plus after the hotfix changes of a week ago, as we continue to monitor all of the changes, the rising and the falling of specs in the meta of Mythic Plus. And this week we have quite a few spicy takes that are happening in Mythic Plus. So let's get right into it. Let's get right into analyzing what's been going on in Mythic Plus. So as usual with our comparisons, this was the situation with tanks before the 9th of January, before we started getting any of the buffs, any of the nerfs to any of the specs. Then we have the situation of last week, and now we have the situation of today. So interesting to see that as we keep going deeper and deeper into this patch, Protection Warrior keeps losing a bit more and a bit more in keys at the 20 plus level. The growth in here is attributed to, for the moment, mostly Protection Paladin, which is rising even more this week compared to last week. Even in keys at the 25 plus range, Protection Warrior is losing some popularity for Protection Paladin as well. I don't think it's going to amount to much. I don't think that without nerfs, Protection Warrior is going to lose its status as the main pick for this tier, but it's good to see some, at the very least, other specs growing. Protection Paladin, for the record, was one of the buffed specs in last week's hotfix in terms of damage done. There is also something interesting to find in healers, because if we check what we had about a month ago, and then we check what we had a bit over a week ago before the hotfix buffs, and then we check what we have now, we do see actually that the gap, if anything, got even larger in favor of Resto Druid. Evoker is still clearly the second most popular, but Restoration Druid is growing a bit more in terms of popularity as the most popular. What is interesting, as I was pointing out, is that now we can start looking, just like we did for tanks, at the 25 plus range of healers. And what is interesting in that range is that the gap between Druid and Evoker isn't nearly as large. As you can see here, Evoker goes from being almost 60% down the Resto Druid to being barely 15% down the Resto Druids. So that is definitely a different type of meta popularity compared to 20 keys, and at the very least, looking at the glass half full, it's not a one-way race like the tanks, with Protection Warrior being the sole dominant of tanks. At the very least here for healers you have two different specs waging for the number one spot. There is also some spiciness when it comes to the melee DPS. As you see here, from over a month ago, the main things we can basically figure out from what changed a month ago is that, as usual, the outlaw rogue domination is getting tinier and tinier. Subtlety is clawing more and more percentages to get even with outlaw, and then of course arms warrior continues to grow to get closer and closer to fury. What I was pointing out being interesting is that once we look at keys at 25 plus and higher, this growth of warrior is basically disappearing in very high keys. In very high keys, it's basically just almost guaranteed to have one rogue. Many times you will have also one Havoc Demon Hunter, and then it's a split between Enhancement and Windwalker Monk. Not too much of a presence of warriors, despite their popularity in the lower-ish level of keys, even though we're talking about 20 keys, which are already quite high. Now, here is the range DPS, which also give us something quite interesting. So, over the course of several weeks and several rounds of hot fixes and buffs and nerfs and whatnot, we see once more the fall of marksmanship, which is getting closer and closer down to Beast Mastery Hunter. We also see the fall of Demo, which is getting closer and closer to Destruction, as well as the fall of Mages, which are getting closer and closer to each other. In this case, Frost Mage trying to get closer to Arcane Mage. The growth of other specs is not that major, right? Shadow Priest going from 7.5 to 9.5 in over a month doesn't look that impressive. However, here is keys 25 plus. Well, now we have basically just a couple of options for the very high keys, when most likely you will have 2 melee DPS. The third option as the range DPS seems to be a choice between Balance and between Shadow Priest. After the significant buffs that Shadow Priest received, now we are in this bizarro world where Shadow Priest is a legitimate option for very high keys, which is definitely a state in which Shadow Priest has, I would say, rarely been in previous expansions and previous tiers of Mythic Plus. Now, talking about weirdness, we have of course our update of most popular comps in Mythic Plus. So we started the whole thing over a month ago, and we noticed how there was a more clear dominance of Restoration Druid, which continued up to a week ago. Apparently this week there has been a rebellion of the Preservation Evoker, because now we jump all the way up to 6 out of 12, so literally a 50-50 split in terms of popularity of most popular comps in Mythic Plus when it comes to healers. But of course the main change is that for the first time in this tier, at least one of the most popular comps in Mythic Plus does not include Protection Warrior, because now it includes Protection Paladin. We have a continuation also of what we had last week, which is 2 Shadow Priests. Last week we also lit a candle for the extinction of Warlocks in the most popular comps. Now they're back. Now 1 Demo and 1 Destro are back in the most popular comps. Also, Hunter is getting closer and closer to going extinct instead, because last week we only had 2 of them, and this week we only have 1 of them. So who knows if next week will be the week where Hunters will go completely extinct in the Mythic Plus popular comps. Mage is still here. Funnily enough, a month ago the most popular comps had 1 Mage and was Arcane. Last week we had 1 Mage and was Frost. This week we have 1 Mage and it's Fire. Also, interestingly to point out, all the way in the 6th of January, most of the rogues, in fact all of the rogues in the top 12 compositions in Mythic Plus were Outlaw. Last week it was a much more even split, because we had 5 Outlaw and 6 sub-rogues last week in terms of a split of specs. This week we have basically only sub-rogues and just 1 Outlaw. 10 sub-rogues and just 1 Outlaw rogue. So definite clear dominance of subtlety in the most popular comps of Mythic Plus. The last of the changes to the most popular comps in Mythic Plus is saying goodbye to Windwalker. So now we have even more Havoc players, we also have even more balanced Druid players, and Windwalker monks are gone from the most popular groups. So definitely we got many changes, many surprises. The most surprising in terms of disappearances and new entries in the most popular comps since we started checking it. This week was definitely a spicy one. We can then finish going back by checking our tier list from sub creation, mostly because we want to check the difference between the tier list, the performance and the ranking of the specs in all of the keys at high level, at mid to high level from plus 16 onwards, and then compare it with their performance in keys at 21 plus level. So a difference in challenge from 16 to 21 keys is quite visible. So this is the situation for tanks in 16 plus keys compared to the situation of tanks in 21 plus keys. The only change from last week is that DK and Demon Hunter are no longer in the B tier. They join the other two specs in the A tier, with Guardian Druid still being quite far below the rest, even though they got their third, fourth, fifth set of buffs in a row. It seems like they are still not taking off. So we will have to wait maybe 10.0.7 to see any meaningful changes to the Druid tank spec. Also, we have a change this week which might be, a bit misleading, because when you look at the keys this week, you see a surprise. We see Discipline Priest out of nowhere, making it into the A tier. Maybe you think it's because it got buffed, it's because the Squid Shadow version of Discipline is now gotten much stronger in Mythic Plus. This week also has Bursting. This week, Mass Dispel is quite strong, given to a Priest, so Discipline maybe has grown this much this week purely because of Bursting. If we go back to look at the situation of healers at 16 plus keys, all the general keys from 16 onwards, the situation is the same as we checked last week. As for the melee DPS, we have no changes in all of the key levels from 16 and above compared to last week. We do have one change in the plus 21 and onwards level of keys for the melee DPS, which is the promotion of Enhancement Shaman into the S tier. This is based on their performance in keys at 21 plus. It's based on the timing of the keys where enhancement were present. It looks like they are doing better this week in Fortified compared to last week's Tyrannical. Other interesting changes are the promotion of Feral and Fury into the A tier from the B tier, as well as a double rank hop of Arms, which goes from C tier to A tier this week. Interestingly, the buffed spec of the week, which was Frost Death Knight, does not seem to have changed whatsoever. We checked yesterday the situation in the raid, and Frost DK did not really grow at all. And this time we look at Mythic Plus, and it doesn't seem like Frost DK is gaining anything in here either. Lastly, we have the situation with the ranged DPS. So we lamented last week when we looked at the tier of performance of ranged in keys higher than 20. We looked at, once again, the S tier of ranged being empty. We pointed out once again how melee were much more dominant, they were much more present in Mythic Plus keys, and ranged DPS were not nearly as well performing. So this week we have two of the specs which hopped back and forth into the S tier, once again back up into the S tier, Shadow Priest and Balance Druid. We also had a few of the specs which were present in and around the A and the B tier, the A and the B tier, up and down, once again all up. Fire Mage, Frost Mage and Destruction Warlock. What is perhaps more surprising is seeing the performance of Elemental Shaman being quite positive. Now, this one being a fortified week, perhaps consistent, lots of AoE damage is what Elemental Shaman is more apt at doing. So perhaps that's what they gain more value this week. Perhaps, in fact, after all, Elemental Shaman has not really been buffed in several weeks, in all of the rounds of hot fixes and buffs of multiple specs, Elemental Shaman has basically been left alone for a long time. So I doubt it's because of some random resurgence of the spec out of nowhere, and more about the fitting week for them. For this week, the B tier of range DPS stands for buffed, because both Beast Mastery and Marksmanship were buffed by 5% to all of their damage. Does not seem to have had too good of an impact, considering they were roughly around the B tier in weeks past already. So we might have to wait a few more weeks, a few more days and resets to see if this 5% damage buff is going to change anything for them, but I doubt it. And also little to no changes to the other of the most buffed specs when it comes to the range DPS, which is Devastation Evoker. We saw Devastation joining hand in hand with Shadow Priest in becoming S tier for the raid, in becoming the top 3 performer in overall damage in the raid with Shadow Priest. Does not look like the buffs to Evoker had the same effect to the spec when it comes to Mythic Plus performance. But at the very least, we have once again a couple of nicely performing range DPS, since we have lamented a few too much of a melee DPS dominance in both the raid and Mythic Plus, so it's nice to see some more better performing, well performing range DPS specs once more. So with this last bit of info and data about the week in Mythic Plus, we are done with our review, with our weekly overview of the situation in Mythic Plus, especially after the round of hotfixes of last week, just to see if some of the buffed specs changed their value, their power, their strength in Mythic Plus. Does not look like the specs that were changed last week had any significant impact so far in Mythic Plus, with the exception perhaps of the growth of Protection Paladin in Mythic Plus, which also got buffed last week. So with this overview, we can stop on this Wednesday. I'm going to leave you back to whatever you were doing. I hope it wasn't anything illegal. If it was, then don't share it with anyone. We don't want no snitches in here. So we are now leaving each other, and as usual, as we start our goodbyes, I'm going to thank all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help towards the growth of this channel. You can of course support in other free ways, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel are a good start. You can also follow me on Twitter, as well as follow my stream on my Twitch channel. That will also be a nice way to check out, to be on top of whenever I have things to share with my viewers. So with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I hate when I thought my cup was full of tea only to realize it's empty, so I have to walk up to the kitchen to get some more. Fucking annoying.